this season. Thank you all for coming. There are lots of familiar faces and there are new faces, and that's delightful. So thank you for being so supportive of this program. It means a lot to me especially, but thank you very much. Today's speaker is Dr. John Kirn, and his title is The Life and Art of Norman Rockwell. Dr. Kirn is a professor emeritus of American History at Bright Point Community College in Midlothian, Virginia. He received his BA from Cornell University and his MA and PhD from the University of Virginia. His research specialty is the Civil War era, but he enjoys teaching and learning about all aspects of American history. Dr. Kirn has always been fascinated with Norman Rockwell, the humor and poignancy of his artwork, and what his popularity tells us about 20th century American society and culture. You are in for a treat, so I introduce to you Dr. John Kirn.
Thank you, Susan. All right, can everybody hear me okay? Even if I shout like this, because I do that sometimes. That sounds pretty clear. Good. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. I'd like to say thank you to the Historic Hopewell Foundation for inviting me, and for Barclay Dupriest of Randolph-Macon in particular, because that's how I hooked up with Susan and the foundation. So, my name is John Kirn. I'm a professor emeritus, meaning I've retired, of American history at Bright Point in Midlothian. I taught at Bright Point Community College for 11 years before I retired in May of 2020, just in time. This is just after the outbreak of COVID, right? And so I've been retired for 4 years, and I don't speak very much, so you guys have to give me a break. Some reflexes you don't forget. I just noticed this, and this is embarrassing, but I'll tell you, before I'd go into class, or at the beginning of class, you know what you do every time? You check to make sure your zipper's up. And I just did the same thing. Because there are times when I got to the end of the class and there's a terrible feeling to realize your zipper's down. All right. In any case, that happened a few times while I was teaching. So I taught at Bright Point for 11 years, and I'll tell you my specialty was the American Civil War. It was not Norman Rockwell, all right? And I will tell you up front that I am not an expert on Norman Rockwell, but I'm trying to be. And I'm close. I am getting there. All right. I have always loved Rockwell's work. And in my 20th century U.S. history courses at Bright Point, I would be able to talk about Rockwell in the context of his 4 freedoms. 4 paintings he made during World War II that really helped Franklin Roosevelt sell the war and our involvement in it to the American people. But I didn't really know much about Rockwell himself. It's only after I retired that I began to read everything that I could about him, and my interest was sparked in particular by a visit to Rockwell's retreat in October of 2022. This is peak leaf season in Vermont. It was beautiful, beautiful fall colors. Rockwell's retreat, and I'm sorry it's kind of small, it's not a big screen, but if you need to move forward, please do so, because we'll have a lot of pictures. But Rockwell's retreat was Rockwell's home in West Arlington, Vermont from 1943 to 1953. And today it's a bed and breakfast. And my wife and I went there, and we knew about it because the owners who took charge shortly before COVID are related to very good friends of ours in Midlothian. But staying in Rockwell's house, touring his restored studio, and this was his studio. He had the big window in there for natural light because he always had to have natural light to paint. No artificial light, that messed him up. But here's the inside of the restored studio. You saw the view he had looking out. There's my wife looking at some of the art books. But this is the view he had looking out his window. The Grange, the White Church, the covered bridge built in 1852, and off here, off the picture, that's a one-room schoolhouse. Very, very Rockwellian. But seeing that view just hooked me, and I've been reading everything about Rockwell that I can ever since, and I've been teaching very short courses on his life. And it's been fascinating. And at the end, I will hand out to you a annotated bibliography with some of the sources I've used for my own talk and my own research. And I'll put it over on the table out there if you would like to have that. I will also hand out a crossword puzzle. I love crossword puzzles, and I always use them in my teaching. And you may not get all the information you need to answer every question in this talk because it's a little bit shorter than normal. But rest assured, the answers are on the second page. So I will put those out afterwards. I learned from classes you don't put out anything like that before, because then people work on them rather than listen to you during class, right? All right, so that's why I'm here. I love Norman Rockwell. I like sharing about him. I'd like to ask you why you're here, but I don't think I have time to do that. And that's a shame, because I love the interaction normally with classes. But this is normally a 2-hour presentation, and I have struggled and struggled and struggled to get it down to 1 hour or less. And so I hope, though, that you'll come up and talk to me afterwards and tell me why perhaps Norman Rockwell is special to you. Did you take the Saturday Evening Post as a child growing up? Was it in your family? Were there special prints or special pictures of him which mean something to you? Tell me about that, because I love that kind of stuff. So I hope we can talk afterward about how Rockwell speaks to you. All right, now the term Rockwellian. What does it mean to you if I say, oh, this is a very Rockwellian scene?
Homey.
Homey. Any other adjectives people want to throw out there?
Americana.
Americana. Whimsical. Very nice.
Boy Scouts of America.
We'll talk about the Boy Scouts of America, yes. He was never a Boy Scout himself, but he's certainly tied to the Boy Scouts. Quaint, sentimental, folksy, absolutely. The term Rockwellian actually became a adjective in 1971. That's when it was first used. Rockwellian, of or relating to Norman Rockwell, known for his idealistic, quaint, or sentimental portrayals of American life. The view of life I communicate in my pictures. This is Rockwell writing in his autobiography in 1960. The view of life I communicate in my pictures excludes the sordid and the ugly. I paint life as I would like it to be. As I would like it to be. And that is key, as I would like it to be. Because as we'll see, his life was not like his pictures. It was very non-Rockwellian. And that's what makes it so interesting. All right, so let me lay out the game plan for this afternoon, what we're going to do in our hour. Normally, as I said, this is a longer presentation, but you'll be glad to know that I have less than an hour to finish it today. And yet we still have a lot to cover. It may be a bit much for you. It's a bit much for me. We're going to take a chronological approach. We'll pay special attention to Rockwell's life during the height of his popularity in the 1940s and the 1950s. We're going to look at his family and his personal life, his 3 wives, his children, his personal characteristics, his idiosyncrasies, and he had many, because that's the context. It's the context, knowing about him and his family. It's the context with which he made his art, right? We're going to look at many of his illustrations. We're going to see how his subject matter and his style changed over time, because it definitely changed. And we're going to spend just a little bit of time looking at the process by which he created his art. Because he did not simply sit down at an easel and paint. Norman Rockwell never did anything, nothing from memory. He had to have a model. He had to have an object in front of him. And the process he went through to produce a cover for the Saturday Evening Post was, you won't believe it. It was incredibly complex. All right, so we will look at that. If we have time, we'll cover it very quickly. Finally, I'll say one word about my slides. Don't expect to read all the text in them. It'll get very busy. Primarily they're there for the pictures, but I always have a lot of information in the slides, because when I give presentations to students, they always get my notes. They always have access to my work. All right, so Norman Rockwell, a little bit of an overview. Of course, he is most famous for the covers he illustrated for the Saturday Evening Post. 323 original covers over 47 years, but he did much more. He did much more. He worked extremely hard. It's clear that Rockwell was a workaholic. He worked 7 hours a day, 7 days a week, 9 hours a day. He was prolific. Produced over 4,000 original works of art, illustrated more than 40 books, the most famous of which were Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn in the mid-1930s. As you said, he created annual illustrations for the Boy Scouts of America calendar from 1925 to 1976, 51 straight years of producing artwork for the Boy Scouts. He painted portraits of every president from 1952 down to 1968. We'll see those. In the 60s, he's going to produce paintings for Look and other magazines. And of course, he's going to create artwork for advertisements. because Rockwell is always worried about supporting his family. And so he found it very hard to refuse commercial jobs because commercial jobs paid much, much better than the Saturday Evening Post. All right, and so he created artwork for Coca-Cola and Jell-O and General Motors, and you can go on and on. Keep in mind that Rockwell did not make a lot of money in his lifetime. He was very comfortable, especially as his career got going, but he was never insanely rich. It's only near the end of his life that the value of his art really escalated. So he needed those advertising jobs. All right, everybody with me so far? All right. Now, let's look at Rockwell's early life. By his own admission, Norman Rockwell was never very close to his parents. He had a mother, father. His older brother here is Jarvis. All right. He was born himself in I dropped my sheet. I don't have it memorized. Born in 1894 in New York City. All right. And as Deborah Solomon, his most recent biographer, and it's a wonderful biography, as she's noted, Norman did not have a very Rockwellian childhood. He's going to spend his first 12 years in a series of cramped apartments in Manhattan. By his own admission, he is not close to his parents or to his brother. He characterized his mother as a self-absorbed hypochondriac who spent most of her life either lying prone on the sofa or visiting doctors. He didn't respect his father. He characterized his father as weak, ineffective. He resented the fact that his father was always waiting on his mother. He indulged her eccentricities. And he didn't get along with that, with his brother that well. And I will say that he wrote that his father was distant. And he wrote, "I was never close to him." And this is very ironic, because Norman Rockwell's three boys will say the exact same thing about him. He was distant. He was never close. And we'll explain more about that. They had a good relationship in the end, but we'll explain more about that. Norman, as I said, never felt close to his older brother Jarvis, and in later years he made no attempt to keep in touch with Jarvis, much to Jarvis's displeasure. But that was Rockwell's style. When he'd move from one community to the next, he never tended to look back. He's always looking forward. What's the next project? I have to get to the next project. I have to focus on that. Doesn't look back. Now, growing up, Rockwell felt neglected by his parents. He felt overshadowed by his brother Jarvis, who was a successful student athlete. Rockwell himself was not an athlete. Now, we know that from pictures of him. He was skinny, he was pigeon-toed, he wore these thick glasses. The early 20th century was all about male bodybuilders. All of America knew how Teddy Roosevelt had transformed himself from this scrawny, sickly child to a rough and ready frontiersman, right? An outdoorsman. And Roosevelt thought that Americans were becoming too weak, too wimpy. And so TR becomes an advocate for the strenuous life. You need to make yourself tough, so you can take anything that the world throws at you. Mentally, physically, you make yourself tough. And Norman tried. He worked out. He went to the gym, but he soon gave up. All right? He's also a poor student. He's a poor student. He struggled with reading and writing. Today, he would be labeled dyslexic. And so Norman has this very poor self-image growing up. Fortunately, in the 8th grade, he had what? A very encouraging teacher. Yes, exactly right. All right. And this is her right here. It's not actually her, but it's Miss Julie M. Smith. And he kept in touch with her the rest of his life. And she was one of the few people from his childhood he remembered fondly. And in tribute to her, he painted this post cover in 1956 as a tribute to Julia Smith, his teacher. The only other person he remembered fondly from his childhood was his eccentric Uncle Gil. And Uncle Gil would always bring Norman and his brother gifts, but he got the holidays mixed up. And so on Easter, he'd bring them Christmas gifts. On July 4th, They'd get Easter bunnies. On Christmas, maybe firecrackers. This 1936 cover is Rockwell's tribute to his Uncle Gil, little boy reaching into grandfather's overcoat. Rockwell wrote in his autobiography, in 1936, when I painted a post cover of a small boy digging into the pockets of his grandfather's overcoat in search of a present, while the grandfather beams down at him, I was really painting Uncle Gil in the old-fashioned spirit of Christmas, which he always typified for me. Norman's mother was a devout Episcopalian. Norman was forced to sing in the all-male boys' choir, which practiced several times a week. It left a lasting distaste for organized religion in his mouth. He never joined or attended church. All right. Weddings and funerals, that was about it for stepping inside of a church. The only part of his childhood that he had an affection for was the 2-week summer vacation that his family would take up in the Adirondack Mountains in upstate New York on a working farm. And he enjoyed that. And those were good memories. And they're going to lead Norman to move in 1938. They're going to lead him to move from the city to Vermont. And when he moves to Vermont, that is going to have a huge impact on his art, as we'll see. All right. Okay, so Norman, we know, displayed a talent for drawing by age of 6 or 7. His father would read to the family from Charles Dickens, and Norman would lie on the floor and sketch out loud. Rockwell is growing up during what is called the golden age of illustration. All right, this was a period in the late 1800s, early 1900s, when there was excellence in the reproduction of pictures in books and magazines, and as a result, you get this outpouring of new books, outpouring of new magazines, these slick glossies that appeared on all types of subjects, and they were all illustrated. They were all illustrated. These magazines were popular entertainment. Now, there's no radio at this point. There's no television. It's the magazines. And so there's great competition for illustrators for these magazines. And these illustrators became well known. They became household names. They became well paid. And most important for young Norman growing up, they were well respected. And that's what Norman wants to do. He wants to be an illustrator. He has no interest in being a Van Gogh. He doesn't care about fine art painters. He wants to illustrate. Forget landscapes. He wants to paint people. He wants to be an illustrator. His personal hero is Howard Pyle, who was known especially for illustrating children's classics. He would always look up to Pyle, who died just as Norman was getting started in his career. But Howard Pyle insisted on factual accuracy in his historical paintings, and Rockwell's going to do the same. All right, so Rockwell always knows what he wants to do. He wants to illustrate magazines just like Howard Pyle. That's how he's going to gain respect. All right. Rockwell's going to leave high school at the end of his junior year. He's going to drop out of high school. He's going to attend the Art Students League in 1911, 1912. He's going to be very, very successful. And at the Art Students League, he's going to exhibit some traits that are going to characterize his work for the rest of his life. First of all, as always, he's going to work very, very hard. Always a hard worker. Secondly, he's going to learn from his instructors that illustration should be technically, factually, historically accurate. If the author is talking about a Windsor chair, for instance, and you have to draw a picture of a boy sitting in a Windsor chair, you better know what a Windsor chair looks like. And if you don't know what a Windsor chair looks like, then you go down to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and you find out what it looks like and you sketch it. Technical, factual accuracy. That is going to be a hallmark of Rockwell throughout his career. He will never paint anything from memory. Never paint anything from memory. He always has a model or some kind of object in front of him. All right. Now, Rockwell is very successful at the Art Students League. He does very well. He flourishes. He wrote in his autobiography, I put everything into my work. This is speaking about, this is a quote I want to get in here when I say, he worked very hard. He says this, very telling. I put everything into my work. A lot of artists do that. Their work is the only thing they've got that gives them an identity. And to this day, I feel that I don't have anything else, and that I must keep working, or I'll go back to being pigeon-toed, narrow-shouldered, a lump. You see how Rockwell is driven. He's driven, and that's why he is a workaholic, always looking forward to the next project. All right. Now, after graduating from the Art Students League, Rockwell's going to get his first job as the art editor for Boys Life. That's the magazine of the Boy Scouts. He is going to, this is wonderful, two scouts helping Santa here who's fallen down the hill. He's going to paint some covers, he's going to paint some story illustrations. All of this is going to lead him to make a few connections. He's going to get assignments for other children's magazines. But Rockwell is restless. He is ambitious. He wants more than children to see his work. And that means he needs to get his work on the cover of the country's largest general circulation magazine, which is the Saturday Evening Post. That's where he has to get. All right, now, in 1914, there's a move which is very important for Rockwell. His family moves from New York City to New Rochelle, a boarding house. And New Rochelle at this time is a very avant-garde community. There are illustrators, cartoonists, writers there. And Rockwell's going to make connections, and those connections will push him to submit his work eventually to the Saturday Evening Post. And in 1916, at age 22, he gets his first cover on the Saturday Evening Post. Now, the Post is a weekly general interest magazine. It mixes journalism with financial investment tips, lots of fictional stories, but it's by far the greatest circulating magazine in the country at that point. And as Rockwell said here, if you did a cover for the Post, you had arrived. And now Norman Rockwell had arrived. This was his very first cover, Boy with Baby Carriage. May 20th, it's a Mother's Day issue. Billy Payne, a model who lives in his boarding house with Rockwell and his family, modeled for all three boys here. But it's a young boy who can't be playing baseball with his friends. He's embarrassed because his friends are going off to play baseball. What? He's pushing his baby sister in a baby carriage. And he has this bottle sticking out of his pocket that makes it look like he has a big female nipple. I mean, how embarrassing. The fear of being tagged as shamed and shamed as a sissy is the overriding concern in this picture, and it is the story of Norman Rockwell's early years. But you also see Rockwell's devotion to detail. I know it's kind of hard back there, but if you get up here, look at the thousands and thousands of brush strokes in that wicker. It is meticulous. It is meticulous. Rockwell's reaction to his first Post cover, 2 million subscribers, and then their wives and their sons and their daughters, aunts, uncles, friends, because you pass the magazine around. Wow, I have arrived. I have arrived. All right. Now, Rockwell is going to publish 5 other covers that same year. He's paid $150 per cover. Ultimately, he will publish 323 original covers for the Post in 47 years, between 1916 and 1963, when he leaves the Post. Everybody with me so far? All right. Now, Rockwell's first marriage to Irene O'Connor in 1916. The same day that the Post agreed to publish his first cover, he proposes to Irene O'Connor. She lives in the same boarding house as Rockwell and his parents. She is a school teacher. And they're married, but they're going to have problems from the start. Norman wrote, after we've been married a while, I realized that she didn't love me. The marriage wasn't particularly unhappy, but it certainly did not have any of the warmth and love of a real marriage. They were married 14 years. They had no children. They often vacationed separately. Irene loved to socialize, and the Rockwells become part of this fast-paced New Rochelle jet set that included artists and writers, people like F. Scott Fitzgerald. This was the 1920s, right? The roaring 1920s. There were country club parties, there were yachts, there was illegal booze because this was Prohibition. And so the Rockwells were part of that jet set. But when they returned from a trip to Europe in 1929, Irene told Rockwell that she wanted a divorce. She had fallen in love with another man, a man who had been on the trip with them to Europe. The grounds for divorce was, quote, mental cruelty. Rockwell had barely looked at her in 14 years. He signed it. And so they're divorced in 1930. Rockwell never saw Irene again. She is going to commit suicide 4 years later. She's going to marry that fellow, but she'll commit suicide 4 years later. That's his first marriage. Here's Norman Rockwell in 1921, age 27. He has made the big time now. He's getting his covers published on the Saturday Evening Post. Let's just look at a few of his covers from those years. Pen pals. I mean, she's writing Dear Sweetheart. The dog's being left behind. Look at the expressions, the emotions in those faces. And whenever you look at a Rockwell, look at the shoes. He is a master at drawing old shoes. The character of those shoes. No Swimming, you've seen that one. Covers are printed in duotone up until 1926. So all Rockwell had to work with was black and red and the colors you get when you mix white into those two. That's all he could work with. But in 1926, he's given the honor of painting the very first full four-color cover for the Saturday Evening Post, Colonial Sign Painter. Boy and girl gazing at the moon. Again, the puppy dog's getting left behind. The fishing pole's getting left behind. You got some wonderful shoes there. Classic Norman Rockwell in the 20s. He's painting covers for other magazines like Popular Science. Doctor and Doll. I mean, you can picture this country doctor here saying, well, how's your dolly doing today? Oh, I don't know. Well, let's check her out, you know. It doesn't happen much today, does it? Yeah. Maybe that's why we feel good about his stuff. Does this explain Rockwell's appeal? Maybe as I grew up and found that the world wasn't the perfectly pleasant place I had thought it to be, I unconsciously decided that even if it wasn't an ideal world, it should be. And so painted only ideal aspects of it. Pictures in which there were no drunken slatterns or self-centered mothers, in which, on the contrary, there were only foxy grandpas who played baseball with the kids, and boys fished from logs and got up circuses in the backyard. And if there was sadness in this created world of mine, it was a pleasant sadness. If there were problems, they were humorous problems. The people in my pictures aren't mentally ill or deformed. The situations they get into are commonplace, everyday situations, not the agonizing crises and tangles of life. All right? And maybe that explains why Norman is so very, very popular even to this very day. The situations they get into are commonplace, right? And we can all relate to this, being ignored by a spouse. Right? The breakfast table. Okay. Norman's second marriage to Mary Barstow, and this is going to last from 1930 until her death in 1959. In 1930, Rockwell is going to take a trip to California to visit a friend. That friend will introduce him to Mary Barstow. She is a school teacher, a Stanford graduate. She wants to write fiction. But right now she's teaching 7th grade and disliking it a whole lot. Mary is 14 years younger than Rockwell. 2 weeks after they meet, Rockwell proposes. 1 month later, they're married in 1930. So Rockwell's 36, Mary is 22. They are going to move into the show house that Norman and Irene built back in New Rochelle. Mary is going to give up her dream of becoming a writer. She is going to become Norman's assistant. She is going to do everything. She's going to make appointments, write correspondence, transport models, find props, run the household, more or less, raise the kids. I mean, the kids said she wasn't much of a mother, but they loved it when she read to them. Her favorite book to read to them was The Hobbit, which is coming out in the 1930s with C.S. Lewis. It's not C.S. Lewis. Who wrote The Hobbit? Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, thank you. All right, Norman and Mary are going to have 3 sons. Jarvis Waring, who's going to become an artist. Thomas, who's going to become a poet, a writer of children's literature. In 1973, for you library people, in 1973 he wrote a famous children's book, How to Eat Fried Worms, which has been very successful. And then Peter Barstow, a sculptor who lived most of his life in Italy. And as often the case with workaholics, Rockwell is going to prove to be an ineffectual, indistracted father. That's a quote from his sons. You know, in their adulthood, the boys understood. They understood the pressures that Rockwell was under. They understood that he was a workaholic, that there was pressure to make money. Remember, he's not getting much money for these paintings. And they're not worth much on themselves. He's throwing them away or giving away right and left. But they often resented his lack of attention to them. And Norman's devotion to his work is also going to contribute to Mary's decline. And here we need to look at Mary's life, because this is a very, very sad story that nobody at the time knew anything about. Because Mary's going to start a long, gradual decline into alcoholism, prescription drug abuse, mental illness, leading to her death in 1959 at the age of 51. So let's look at Mary. These are the facts. By 1934, Mary's taking large quantities of caffeine pills. By the late 1930s, she's a closet alcoholic. The boys could never understand why they didn't see this. How could we have missed this? In 1938, the family travels to England where Mary has an abortion. This reportedly is going to affect her the rest of her life. In 1951, she's admitted to the Austin Riggs Psychiatric Center, that's in Stockbridge, for the first time, and she will remain there off and on for the rest of her life until 1959. In the early 50s, as Rockwell talks to Mary's doctors, he also begins taking mood-lifting prescription drugs because he has a lot of social anxieties. So they calm him when he has to meet people. He starts seeing famed psychoanalyst Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson came up with this whole notion of an identity crisis that can occur after a major life change or a traumatic event in your life. But Erik Erikson becomes like a god to Rockwell, his closest personal friend and advisor. And in 1953, Rockwell is going to move from Arlington, Vermont to Stockbridge, Massachusetts to be closer to Mary, who is there, but also so he can begin regular therapy with Erikson. And this is a great quote. I love this quote from the NPR staff, National Public Radio. They're writing about Rockwell and his family and their therapy visits, and they said, behind Rockwell's idyllic America, there were a lot of therapy bills, because at one time, 4 of the 5 Rockwells were all in therapy. All right. Mary's use of alcohol and prescription pills over a long period is going to lead to her eventual death from heart disease in 1959. And Rockwell is going to publish his autobiography in 1960, and none of this, not a bit of this, is mentioned. It's not the place to go if you want to know definitively what Rockwell's life was about. It's a wonderful story, but it's not definitive. The only thing he mentions is his debt to Erikson and his use of happy pills to relieve his panic attacks, which he strongly endorses. All right, now, how do you explain Mary's long decline? You got the Rockwell family versus Deborah Solomon. This is current scholarship now. This is what's going on in the literature now among scholars. Traditionally, Mary's decline and death have been attributed by historians in the Rockwell family to some undisclosed childhood trauma she had, which resurfaced later in life, to her mental illness, her alcoholism, her seeming guilt over her abortion, some bad psychiatric advice she received, her addiction to prescription antidepressants. And the family has portrayed Rockwell, and scholars as well, as a workaholic, but one who nevertheless cares very deeply for Mary. He's doing everything he can to help her through this. But not everybody agrees. And so in 2013, Deborah Solomon, who wrote this wonderful biography, American Mirror, The Life and Art of Norman Rockwell, and I hardly recommend it. It's going to be on the annotated bibliography. But she is going to lay much more of the blame for Mary's decline on Rockwell himself and his lack of attention to Mary. This is only a small part of the book, but she raises the question of whether Rockwell was in fact a repressed homosexual, a gay man who never acted out on his impulses, and he used marriage to cover them up. Because it is clear that throughout his life, Rockwell always had his best relationships with men. I'm not talking sexual relationships. There's no evidence of any of that. I'm just saying closeness. He preferred being with men as opposed to women. His closest friends were always men. And he was distant from Mary. And so he'd go off on camping trips with other men, not with Mary. He wouldn't vacation with. So Solomon sees Rockwell's distance from Mary as integral to her decline. She took a backseat to his career throughout the marriage. She was overwhelmed with managing Rockwell's business. Solomon says she was responsible for any errand that involved driving because Rockwell didn't want to drive. She's responsible for raising the children. Her abortion caused her pain. She oversaw the care of Rockwell's mother in Rhode Island because he didn't take time to do that. And she's frustrated that her own goal to be a fiction writer is going nowhere, and she's depressed as the children leave the household. And so that helps to explain for Deborah Solomon Mary Rockwell's decline. All right, so that's what's going on in terms of Rockwell scholarship these days. Now, let's look at the Arlington years, because this is wonderful. This is going to be the most productive part of Rockwell's life here, 1939 to 1953. Moving to Arlington, Vermont had given my work a terrific boost, because now my pictures grew out of the world around me, the everyday life of my neighbors. All right. Rockwell was a city boy. He grew up in New York City, fast-paced New Rochelle. But country living had always appealed to him. And in the fall of 1938, Norman and Mary buy this farm in the southern Vermont town of Arlington. They said, well, we want to spend summer there with the boys. And you know, a new location will reinvigorate my work, because Rockwell's always worried about drying up. He's always scared. What if those ideas stop? They're so hard to come by, you know? So a change of atmosphere is always good. He's always full of anxiety, always full of self-doubt, always questioning himself, always needing reaffirmation. That is Norman Rockwell. But they found a farm to buy, a plain farmhouse overlooking the Battenkill River, one of the best trout fishing streams in Vermont. And the Rockwells come to stay at the farm in the summer of 1939. They decide, well, we're not going to leave. We're going to move here permanently, and that's what they do. And almost immediately, Rockwell's style changed, because it moved from working on a lot of colonial history and American history, which he tended to concentrate on, to the everyday lives of his Vermont neighbors. Rockwell is not able to hire professional models in rural Vermont. They're just not there. And so now he begins hunting down friends and neighbors. In all, in the 14 years he's in Vermont, 250 neighbors are going to model for him, many more than once. And these people are going to bring a freshness to his work. And the townsfolk, you know, they're always curious. When a new edition of the Post comes out, who's going to be on that cover? Who's going to be on that cover? You never knew, because he often had multiple models for scenes. He never knew which one he was going to actually pick in the end. But let's look at some of his covers here from the Vermont years. So this was his very first cover after moving to Vermont. Marble champion, Ruthie McClenathan he found in New York. He goes far and wide to find his models. He loves girls who are redheads, usually tomboys, and that's what she was. And she knew how to play marbles. And here she is beating the boys. You know, that's Rockwell's son Jarvis, the butcher's son right there. Their bag's empty. She has all the marbles, right? And she's having fun. Going and Coming. This is a masterpiece, all right? Solomon, a masterpiece that captures something profound about family outings. We all love family vacations, but we know they can be exhausting, especially when the kids are young, right? So everybody's happy on the way out to the lake. Got the little canoe up on top, but on the way back, everybody's kind of beaten down. Mom's sleeping, Dad looks kind of grumpy. The only person who's the same is who? Well, the dog, but somebody else. It's Grandma. Look at Grandma right there.
Oh, yeah.
And Grandma right here. And that's how she was in real life. This was the grandmother who lived next door to the Rockwells. And that was her grandchildren said that was her expression her whole life, and it never changed. All right. I think most of you are familiar with Rockwell's 4 freedoms. Let me set some context here for you with the 4 freedoms. World War II breaks out in September of 1939. By the fall of 1940, most of Europe has fallen to the Nazis. Great Britain has barely survived the Blitz in August and September of 1940. Roosevelt's going to be elected to an unprecedented 3rd term in November of 1940 on the grounds that, you know, the world is in turmoil. This is no time to change administrations. And yet, prior to Pearl Harbor, our country is deeply divided over whether or not we should be involved in World War II. There is a very strong commitment to isolationism in this country. We should remain neutral, many people say. Charles Lindbergh led this drive. We should remain neutral, and we should stay out of the European war at all costs, because World War I had been so disillusioning. But Roosevelt is committed to providing Britain with all the military and financial assistance he can. I'm not sending men, but we need to support them. Because if we don't support them, Britain's going to fall. And if they fall, we are going to be isolated in a world full of dictators. And so Roosevelt has to make the American people understand that we need to support Great Britain in their efforts. We need to provide financial aid. We need to provide weapons. In his annual message to Congress in January of 1941, he speaks of 4 fundamental freedoms that people everywhere in the world should enjoy. What are those freedoms? Give me one. Freedom of speech. Freedom of religion.
Freedom to make. Freedom from want.
Freedom from want.
Freedom to meet together.
No, not to meet together.
Freedom from fear.
Freedom from fear, very good. All right, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. And these universal freedoms are written into the Atlantic Charter. They get written into the Charter of the UN. Rockwell wants to use his artistic skills to help the war effort. And so he's in D.C. in May of 1942, and he meets with an official, and he says, the official says, one of our most urgent needs is we need a series of posters on the 4 freedoms. And so Rockwell returns to Vermont with the Atlantic Charter tucked under his arm, and he struggles of, well, how do you portray freedom? How do you portray freedom without resorting to these typical patriotic images of Uncle Sam or the Statue of Liberty? It torments him. What does freedom look like in a painting? And then it comes to him at 3 a.m. one morning, aha, I've got it. Because he had recently attended a town meeting in West Arlington. And his neighbor, Jim Egerton, had stood up to criticize a decision that the town had made. The decision to rebuild a school that had burned down. And nobody agreed with Jim Egerton. Nobody liked what he had to say. But they listened to him. And they listened to him respectfully. That, Rockwell says, is freedom of speech. And so I am going to produce posters that show Americans doing ordinary things that affirm basic, ordinary American values. I mean, the genius of the 4 freedoms is that Rockwell is going to take these 4 words, these abstract words of Roosevelt, and he's going to turn them into pictures that every person can relate to and understand. And so a month later, he has 4 charcoal drawings. He takes them back to Washington. Washington doesn't want them. Oh, we've changed our mind. We're going to have other people illustrate. On his way back, he stops at the post office, and the editor, Ben Hibbs, at the Saturday Evening Post says, well, we will publish them. And so, get to work. And so Rockwell gets to work. And the paintings did not come easily. It's going to take him 7 months of continuous labor. He's exhausted. Rockwell's going to lose 15 pounds in the process. And Rockwell's skinny to begin with. But these are the 4 freedoms. Freedom of speech. A laboring man, perhaps, you can tell by his jacket, stands up to speak at a town meeting, and he's listened to respectfully. Very important for Rockwell. It's one of Rockwell's most popular paintings. It was an ordeal for him, though. The model here is Carl Hess, who owns a gas station in Arlington. Freedom of worship, probably the least successful of his freedom paintings. Solomon says it looks like a wall of flesh that leaves no place for the eyes to wander, but each according to the dictates of his own conscience. All right, freedom of worship. Freedom from what? This is the most famous of them, right? You all recognize this one. It's a masterpiece of white-on-white painting. White on white. The ability to use white objects on a white tablecloth. You know how things stick out? This is Mrs. Wheaton. This is actually Rockwell's cook, and she's serving the real Thanksgiving turkey. Of course, these people aren't here. They're models. They all posed separately for Rockwell. But that was Rockwell's real Thanksgiving turkey in 1942, and then they ate it, right? And that's her husband, who is Rockwell's handyman, caretaker. This is Rockwell's mother, right here. You get to know all these people. It's so much fun getting to know all these local townspeople, the 250 that are at the various paintings. And you see many of them more than once. There was one person who was in all 4 of these freedom paintings. All right? This guy right here. All right. Freedom from what? One of his most accomplished works. Freedom from fear. You know, a parent should be able to tuck a child into bed at night without worrying about whether they'll be safe when they wake up in the morning. That's why we need to be involved in this war. You note the newspaper headlines referring to the bombing or the Blitz in London, right there. And this is funny, I have to say this, even though we're running short on time. The father's wearing a pair of recognizable suspenders. We wouldn't recognize them, but back then everybody said, oh, that's a pair of Pioneer suspenders. And the president of the Pioneer Suspender Company wrote to Rockwell, and he said, he sent Rockwell 3 pair. And he wrote, of course he has freedom from fear. His trousers are held up by a pair of our suspenders. Some see the 4 freedoms here as the crowning achievement of Rockwell's career. Others feel that his works of art, they are not as good as his covers because they don't tell a full story as his covers tend to do. But as interpreted by Rockwell, joining in this war effort, it's not about killing the enemy, it's about saving a way of life, because most everyone knows what it's like to attend a town meeting or gather for a Thanksgiving dinner or tuck your children into bed at night. But they've been reproduced more than any other paintings in history. All right? They become part of a government traveling show to help sell war bonds for the war. All right, now, shortly after he finishes the Four Freedoms, Rockwell's studio burns down. He loses immense quantities of stuff, but he's okay with that. He is now going to move from Arlington to West Arlington into this colonial house right here. This is the bed and breakfast where my wife and I stayed, right? And he'll be there from 1943 to 1953. He'll be next to the Edgertons, a dairy farmer. They're going to become absolute best friends. I mean, the families just go in and out of each other's houses. And right here is a book written by Buddy Edgerton, the boy who modeled for Rockwell many times, who lived in this house. It's called The Unknown Rockwell, a portrait of two American families. And it's over on the table there if you want to look at it afterwards. Actually, it's down here, but it will be over on the table. Yeah. So he moves. He wanted to be closer to neighbors for Mary's sake. They were kind of isolated where they were at first. And so this is where he has his studio. He puts in the big picture window there. He has that view of the village green. Some of his other stuff from the 1940s, his other war contributions. And, some people say Rockwell's not an artist. That's a whole controversy we don't have time for today that I normally talk about. Is he an artist or is he an illustrator? Is there a difference? He's an artist. Come on. Look at the emotion. Look at the emotion in that face. Look at the emotion in that face. Rosie the Riveter, we all know. This is painted in the same pose as the Hebrew prophet Isaiah in the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Mary Doyle was a telephone operator in West Arlington. She was this slight little girl with little arms. And her face gets put on another body, and she's crying when it comes out because she's so embarrassed, and Rockwell has to go and apologize to her for giving her these huge arms and posing her in an unladylike fashion, right? But we know Rosie the Riveter. And just to get a sense of Rockwell's humor, Rosie the Riveter, this is in honor of all the women working in the defense industries who are helping us produce what we need for the war effort, right? But Rosie's not working at all. She's on a lunch break. That's the kind of thing. Those are the subtle humors you can find in Rockwell's paintings all the time. The Willie Gillis post covers, there were 11 in all, but it focuses not on the flyboys, not on the famous Hollywood type soldiers, but on the everyday private. All right. Homecoming GI. Rockwell's going to find this building in Troy, New York. He's going to search for 2 days to find a building that he wants to use for this. He often gets criticized for his lack of African Americans in his paintings. A lot of that has to do with the conservative Saturday Evening Post that he's painting for. But his family says, well, this is an example here. It's a very multicultural neighborhood that he's found here. Homecoming GI, and if we had more time, we know who all these people are in Arlington and what they do, and they've recorded their experiences being models for Rockwell. Homecoming Marine. All right, so a Marine telling stories of Iwo Jima. This is Bob Benedict. He's a garage owner. John Benedict, his brother. Jarvis, that's Rockwell's oldest son right there. Dwayne Parks is a U.S. Marine on home at leave. This is Nip Noyes in his postal uniform. All right, we got Herb Squires. He's the brother of Rockwell's builder. And this is Peter Rockwell, Rockwell's youngest. And so, again, you get to know all these faces here, but he's always looking for the right model for the right occasion. He's always on the lookout. And you know where he scopes out his children models? At the elementary school. He goes to the playground, and he turns you around. He says, how would you like to come to my studio with me and model for me? Think you could get away with that today? But back then you could, because the principal knew what was going on. Anyway, everybody knew Norman Rockwell. He was very much accepted into the community and a big part of it. The tattoo artist is great. This guy has traveled because his former girlfriends were Sadie, Rosietta, Ming Fu, Mimi, Olga, Singlo. He must be home now because now it's Betty. But Rockwell goes down to the Bowery to do his research for that. The babysitter, she's consulting a manual. Christmas Homecoming, this is the only one where all the Rockwells are in it. And so that's Mary Rockwell hugging her older son Jarvis, who is probably coming home from college, right? You got Norman here. You got Tommy, the middle son. You got Peter, the younger son. Who is this right here? Grandma Moses, who is a good friend of Rockwell. She lived about an hour away in New York. Yeah. Perhaps the most famous baseball painting of all time. It's in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. It actually makes no sense. People haven't been able to try to figure this one out, but I don't have time to get into that, but we can talk about it afterwards if you want to. But I love this. Bottom of the sixth. Is the game going to be called or is it not going to be called? All right. In the 50s, his work becomes much more introspective. Shuffleton's Barbershop is a classic. It's the Rockwell children's famous, they say it's his best work, all right? But it's an example of his meticulous realism. You know, it's photorealism. He's painting things exactly, and he has models and photographs for all this stuff. Saying Grace, voted by the Post readers as their favorite cover, hands down. And this is going to sell at auction. This has sold more than any other painting for $47 million. But it's in a greasy spoon diner outside of a train station. It's the Thanksgiving issue. And a grandmother and her son are saying grace, and everybody's looking on with, you know, different looks, saying, well, what's going on here? But respectful. That's what Rockwell says about this painting. Everybody's looking at them with curiosity, but respect. But respect. Yeah, sold at auction 2013 for $46 million. That's the highest that a Rockwell's ever gone for. The Shiner. All right, Mary Whalen. Again, another redhead. She's probably just hit a boy and she's loving it, right? She doesn't care what the principal's going to do to her. It makes no difference. She is happy, right? Norman had to figure out how to paint a black eye. How do you paint a black eye? He advertised in the newspaper, I need somebody with a black eye to come to my studio. One boy, aged 2 or 3, 2.5, fell down a flight of stairs, had 2 black eyes. They came and modeled for, but hundreds of people responded to Norman's ad. And of course, he's doing ad work during all this because he needs to pay the bills. All that treatment for Mary at Austin Riggs and for his other children is very, very expensive. There's always pressure for Norman to pay those bills. All right. Now, this is hard for me. We're skipping so much good stuff here. All right. But we have only a few minutes. The Stockbridge years. In 1953, Rockwell's going to move to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Why? He wants to be closer to Mary. It's about an hour and a half from Arlington. That's where the Austin Riggs Center is, and so he can be closer to Mary, but he can also start his own sessions with Erik Erikson. And once he starts therapy, you'll see Rockwell's work becomes much more introspective. This is Girl at the Mirror. This is the same model. Mary Whalen is the Shiner. But she's looking in the mirror with a copy of the actress Jane Russell magazine in her lap saying, am I ever going to look like that? And so it's a coming-of-age type picture. Look at her doll thrown to the side. You know, she's kind of moving beyond that now. Mary was her favorite, was his favorite girl model because of the range of expressions he could get from her. Breaking Home Ties is many people's favorite. All right, one of his most emotional paintings. I was trying to express what a father feels when his son leaves home. Rockwell goes to New Mexico to find this truck and this train station they're outside of. Look at the expression on the dog's face. The dog's sad too. The dad's leaving, losing his best ranch hand, but the son is excited. He is ready to go to State U here. All right, before the shot, the only boy who had to be a little bit nude when he modeled. And this is triple self-portrait. This is what Norman wrote for the frontispiece of his autobiography, which he published in 1960. So he publishes his autobiography in 1960. It's published in 8 installments in the Post. His autobiography is fun to read. It's very humorous. It is very well written. But understand that it's also very incomplete, because he gives you long descriptions of his Navy buddies and the people who lived in the boarding houses he grew up in, but he never mentions his marriages, he never mentions his politics, he never mentions his psychiatrist, he doesn't discuss anybody who dies, including his wives. All right, so it's incomplete, and it ends in 1960, and there's much more to the story, because Rockwell now is going to leave the conservative Saturday Evening Post and become much more political in the 1960s. We can see this now with the Golden Rule, right? What Rockwell is doing here, he is integrating the Saturday Evening Post. Because the Post has a rule that blacks are not allowed on the cover unless they're in a servile position. And he is putting people front and center. He is integrating the Post here. He's pushing. Rockwell's wife Mary. Remember, she died in 1959, a few months before the birth of her first grandson, which she was really looking forward to. And so Rockwell sticks her in back here holding that grandson, even though she's passed away. There's so much in every painting. They are so thought out. It's meticulous. It's why it takes them so long to come up with these things. You think, oh, it's a magazine cover. No. This process takes him a month or more to complete each time, sometimes 3 months for one cover. All right, his third marriage in 1961, he's going to marry Molly Punderson. This is great. This is his most successful marriage. They just get along really well. She takes over his business. She loves doing it. She is a retired English teacher. They meet because Rockwell's told by a psychiatrist, well, you got to get out and do something. So he takes her poetry class at the library. All right? Takes her a free poetry class, and they meet, and they're going to be very happy, and she's going to run his career the rest of their lives. Rockwell is going to leave the conservative Saturday Evening Post in 1963. The Post is not doing well. They're still the third leading magazine in the country, but they can't get advertisers because most of the advertisers are advertising the first two. They're stodgy. They're old. They have this sense that they're not current, and so they say, well, we're going to redesign the magazine. We're going to bring in more modern artwork. We're going to bring in photography so we can compete with life and look. And they do that, and now they start to have photographs as well as illustrations on the cover. And they tell Rockwell, we want you to do portraits now. And for Rockwell, I'm not a portrait artist. I tell stories. That's what I do. I love to tell stories and pictures. For me, the story is the first and the last thing. And so Rockwell says, I have no future here. And so he's going to leave the Post in 1963 at age 69. And now in the 60s, pushed by Molly, who is very much a progressive Democrat, pushed by Eric Ayerson, a psychoanalyst who is the same, he is going to center in the 1960s on civil rights. That is going to be his big issue. He's going to produce 3 big paintings. This becomes one of the most famous paintings of the civil rights movement, The Problem We All Live In. And it's Ruby Bridges being escorted into the William Franz Elementary School in New Orleans in 1960. He publishes it in 1964, but that becomes the biggest, most famous image of the civil rights movement. In fact, I was just at the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis, Tennessee last March, and they had a big reproduction of this there. Here's another one. Southern Justice, also known as Murder in Mississippi, it depicts the murder of the 3 civil rights workers by the Klan in June of 1964. And it's printed inside Look magazine. He's not printing on covers anymore, but this is Norman Rockwell. And look what he says. For 47 years, I portrayed the best of all possible worlds. Grandfathers, puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now. And I think it's about time. I mean, that shows you the angst, the anxiety that the 1960s produced here. That's huge. This is Norman Rockwell. Integrating a neighborhood. You know, white versus black. They're surrogates for the larger society. What's going to happen here now? And of course, the white kids have a black dog and the black kids have a white cat. We know animals don't care, right? There's so much in all of these. All right. Rockwell also, can I have a few more minutes and I'll finish up? Is that okay? If you have to leave, I understand. He's going to do a lot of political portraits during his life. From 1952 to 1978, 1968, he'll get every presidential portrait there. Ike is his absolute favorite. This is 1952. I honestly think that Ike has the most expressive face I've ever painted. You just can't help liking him. He got along really well with Ike. He really liked Ike. Kennedy, he loved. He had a good time with Kennedy. Nixon, not so much. All right. Peter Rockwell said, my father said the problem with doing Nixon is if you make him look nice, he doesn't look like Nixon anymore. I'm sorry if you're a Nixon liker, but you know. LBJ in 1964, and this is a very nice Nixon in 1968. Right? LBJ liked this much better than his official presidential portrait. One of his last portraits in 1973, Colonel Sanders of Kentucky Fried Chicken fame. Rockwell and the Boy Scouts. So Rockwell is always identified with the Boy Scouts because from 1925 down to 1976, he produced the cover for the annual Boy Scouts calendar. And lots of other stuff, lots of other things for their books, for their publicity, all kinds of stuff. they're not among his best works because the Boy Scouts had very strict standards. The uniforms always had to be pressed in his pictures. The kerchiefs perfectly tied. And so this is a Kansas City flood in 1938, and the Boy Scouts are helping to rescue people, and Norman has to paint over the raindrops that he put on the boys' uniform so it would look neater. That's what the Boy Scouts demanded. So it's not always his best work, but he's known, even though he himself never belonged to the Boy Scouts, he's always had this attachment to them. A lot of his Boy Scout paintings are on display at the Medici Museum of Art in Ohio, but they may be sold, of course, because the Boy Scouts is in bankruptcy, and so they may be sold to help them get out of that bankruptcy. I will do my best. All right, 481 images for the Scouts total. This was the boy next door, Buddy Edgerton. I haven't had a chance to talk much about the Edgertons next door, but they were just so close. And Buddy was used in 4 different scouting portraits. So this is a guiding hand. This is Rockwell's son, Tommy, right there. And then he brought Buddy back in 1964 as an adult and put him here. Aged him 10 years here, took 10 years off there, and then used Buddy's son as the Cub Scout. And he called this Growth of a Leader. And again, that's the book, The Unknown Rockwell, that Buddy wrote. About their relationship with the Rockwell family. And of course, Christmas. We love his Christmas stuff, don't we? Have a Rockwellian Christmas. They're just so cute. They're so inventive. I mean, I love this jolly postman. All the kids are so excited. I mean, you don't see too many postmen with packages hanging out like that anymore. Santa consulting the globe. I'm sorry to go so fast. And this is my favorite here, the discovery. A little boy finds a Santa suit in the bottom of his father's bureau, right? Last thing, Rockwell's method. I have to say this because, you know, Rockwell does not sit down and just paint from memory. He has a whole process he goes through. And the first part of it is coming with ideas, and this was always the hardest part for him. So this was his first self-portrait in 1938, trying to come up with ideas. A very hard thing to do. It's the hardest work I did in those days. I had to beat them out of me, but at least they kept coming. But he insists, every canvas must tell a complete story. Absolutely. So he's trying to come up with ideas. He does develop ways to do that eventually. So that's the first part of the process. The second, and I will say some ideas do come easy. He says, you know, if there's a current fad going on, in 1929 it was all about speed traps. They were a new thing. So he publishes this cover in 1929, speed traps. And then in 1949, televisions are new. And so this guy's so happy because, hey, I have a picture, you know. But other things came very hard. Ideas came very hard to Rockwell. He had to put a lot of work into it. The second thing is you got to recruit models and props. And so he always had associates and assistants and himself and people going out looking for the right person for the right job. As George Lucas of Star Wars fame, who has many, many Rockwell paintings, said, you know, he cast a painting. It wasn't just a random group of characters. He cast it. And he found the right person. Recruiting models. Here he stuck himself and his wife into this one right here. Where's Rockwell? Here's Rockwell down here. And his wife, right here. Because he was afraid that the town would think that he was calling them all gossips. Well, this is the gossips. This is my dad, who was a communications professor, favorite print. But he used his neighbors, and they said to him, well, we're not gossips, are we? So, you know, there was only one lady who, when it came up, was really offended. And he says, I dare say the proverbial shoe fit a bit too well. And that was this lady up here. But he's using the people. He's using the people of Arlington, Vermont, and they loved it. They loved it. And then he's directing and photographing, and so he's putting people in the right position. He's really good at making people feel comfortable, at people getting them to pose the way that he wants them to pose. He's really good at that. The children said, all of them, he made me feel very comfortable working for him. And he would act himself to get the looks he wanted. You put it on boots so that when the photograph is taken now, you can get, you know, what does it look like with your shoes when you're walking like that? You know, lots of techniques. You got if you're flying on a bicycle or something, you use a string here to hold up your pigtails or your coat. All right, so he's helping models to pose, and then he's photographing them. And he started using photographs in the late 30s, and he felt very, very guilty about this. But it's what everybody began doing because you can capture so much more detail with photographs. And it changed the nature of his pictures. And yet, to the end of his days, he felt guilty about it. He felt guilty because, I should just be having live models. You can't have live models in Vermont. They're workers. They can't take off hours to pose for you. And so you bring them in, you take their photograph, and you work from the photographs. And that's what Rockwell did beginning in the late 1930s to the end of his career. And so here you see the photograph, the picture. Tired salesgirl on Christmas Eve, the photograph, the picture. He had a hard time finding this lady. The picture, the painting. The various people staged individually, the painting. All right. Photography was key. There were details, accidents of light, which I'd missed when I'd been able to make only quick sketches of a setting. A photograph catches all that. And then the last thing here, he would use a bolopticon. All right, so this is what happens. He has a rough sketch of what he wants in this painting. He puts it on his bolopticon, which is like a projector. It projects it onto an easel on a piece of paper. He sketches in that rough sketch. All right, now he takes photographs, maybe 100 photographs per painting, cut up in little pieces, and he arranges them however he might want, because every object here is going to have a separate photograph. And he's going to arrange them, and he's going to put them on the bolopticon and make them smaller or bigger, and he's going to work them into a scene, and he's going to sketch them. And then he's going to take a picture of what he has, and he'll add color to that picture, and he'll work out his color scheme. And then he might take that colored picture, or he might take the original charcoal sketch, put it back in the bolopticon, and project it now onto an easel, onto a primed canvas, and now he'll sketch out on the canvas his scene, and then he can start to lay colors on the canvas. This is a long process. It would take him a month or more to produce a cover for the Saturday Evening Post. And so if you think of artists as sitting down and just painting from memory, that's not how it worked for him. His attention to realism, to detail, was so incredible, he had to do it this way. All right, we'll skip that. Was Norman Rockwell an artist or an illustrator? I think we can agree that pretty much he was an illustrator. He tried to reinvent himself several times to be more of an abstract expressionist, because that's what real artists were supposed to be, abstract expressionists like Jackson Pollock. But he said, and he went away to Europe. He said, every time I went away to try and learn a new technique, I always came back, and when I painted, it came out Norman Rockwell. And we're glad it did. And most of those Norman Rockwells are worth a lot more today than a lot of the abstract expressionist paintings that he was competing with back then. He never got respect from the art community. Even to this day, people will deny that he was an artist. They'll say, well, no, he was an illustrator. He was commercial. He worked for money. He was commercial. But he tried to outdo them. Right here, last thing, this is the connoisseur. And he has to actually do a Jackson Pollock himself to make this painting. And so here he is using that drip method where you just sort of drip paintings in order to make that cover. And this artist, William de Kooning, says square inch by square inch. He did it better than Jackson Pollock. All right? He had nothing against the expressionists. He said, if I were young, I would paint that way myself, but it always comes out Rockwell. And I think we're glad that it does. All right, I went 10 minutes over. I'm so sorry. But I appreciate your attention. And if you have experiences with Rockwell or things that you love about him or questions, please come up and talk to me.